Sometimes fate plays with men's dreams, as the wind plays with dry leaves in the desert. Thomas Mitchell was watching the skyline for the 5th time that morning, his calloused hands gripping the wooden fence he had built himself. The ranch stretched out before him like a sea of golden grass, rippling under the relentless Arizona sun. 3 years had passed since he decided to look for a companion through the letters, and today she would finally arrive at the stagecoach at 2 in the afternoon. The correspondence began when loneliness became too heavy to carry alone. Silent nights around the campfire, conversations with only the horse, and the days that dragged on without the sound of a female voice had made his life an empty routine. Through the Phoenix newspaper, he found her ad, young woman, 25 years old, looking for a working husband to start a family in the West. In the letters they exchanged for 2 years painted the portrait of a sweet girl, with brown hair and simple dreams. The afternoon heat made the air shimmer over the dusty road. Thomas had shaved twice that morning, put on his best shirt, and polished his boots until they gleamed. At the kitchen table, she waited for a bouquet of wildflowers that she picked before dawn, when the dew still covered the delicate petals. His thoughts flew to the letters stored in his bedroom drawer. In them, Margaret described her life in Missouri, afternoons helping her mother with sewing, Sundays at the small-town church where she grew up. She wrote about her dreams of owning a home, children running around the yard, dinners prepared for her husband after a hard day's work. Thomas smiled as he remembered the delicacy with which she described the recipes she had learned, promising to prepare apple pies and freshly baked bread every day. The distant sound of wheels on rocks made his heart race. The stagecoach appeared like a dark dot against the blue sky, raising a cloud of dust that spread like smoke. Thomas adjusted his hat and walked toward the road, his steady steps masking the anxiety growing in his chest. The stagecoach stopped with a creak of wood and metal. The coachman came down first, greeting Thomas with a wave. Then the door opened and a gloved hand appeared, followed by a dark blue skirt. When the woman stepped onto the dusty earth and turned to him, Thomas felt the world stop. Grey hair escaped from a modest hat. Delicate wrinkles marked the corners of blue eyes that carried the wisdom of many winters. She was not 25. I wasn't even 40. The woman standing before him, with a gentle smile and hands that showed decades of work, must have been at least 55. Margaret approached him with measured steps, carrying a small suitcase of worn leather. Her eyes met his, and in that moment, Thomas saw a deep kindness that the letters had only hinted at. She spoke in a soft voice, apologizing for not revealing her true age, explaining that she feared she would never find a good man if she told the truth. The wind blew between them, carrying the scent of the wildflowers Thomas had gathered. As the stagecoach moved away, leaving them alone in the wilderness, he realized that his life was about to take a turn he had never imagined. Margaret stood there, waiting for his reaction, her eyes full of hope and fear, like someone who had staked everything on one last chance at happiness. Thomas looked at this woman who had traveled more than 1,000 miles to find him, and something in his heart began to move, like water finding a crack in the hardest rock. The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Thomas felt the weight of the unspoken words as he watched Margaret nervously adjust the straps of her suitcase. The afternoon sun cast long shadows around them, and the wind carried the dry scent of mugwort. Margaret broke the silence first, her voice charged with painful honesty. She told about the years she spent taking care of her sick mother, how time had passed without her noticing. He explained that when he was finally free to pursue his own happiness, he had already lost the youth that men were looking for. The letters were her only hope of finding someone who could love her for who she was on the inside, not just her looks. Thomas listened to every word, seeing the courage it had taken for her to make that journey. He watched as her hands trembled slightly, as she held her chin up despite the fear evident in her eyes. There was something about that woman that touched a part of him that had been dormant for a long time. Without saying a word, Thomas took the suitcase from his hands and began to walk toward the house. Margaret hesitated for a moment before following him, her steps cautious on the dirt. The wooden house stood modestly but solid, with a porch that offered shade during hot afternoons. Wildflowers grew disorderly around the foundation, creating patches of color against the sun-faded wood. Inside the house, the table was set for two. Margaret noticed the careful details, the clean plates, the polished glasses, the fresh flowers in the center of the table. Thomas had prepared to welcome her as a bride, not as a stranger who needed to be judged. The kindness of that gesture made her feel tears burn her eyes. Thomas made coffee as she sat in the wooden chair, watching his precise movements around the kitchen. There was something comforting about the way he knew every corner of this house, how familiar his footsteps sounded on the wooden floor. As he placed the steaming cup before her, his fingers touched briefly, and Margaret felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the hot liquid. They talked until sunset painted the sky orange and purple. Margaret talked about her life in Missouri, about the long nights sewing by candlelight, about the books she read to escape the monotony of the days. Thomas shared stories about the ranch, about the cold mornings feeding the cattle, about the storms that tested his resolve to stay in that barren land. As night approached, the initial tension gave way to something deeper. Margaret discovered that Thomas was a man of few words, but each of them carried weight and sincerity. He found that she possessed gentle wisdom, born of years of observing human nature and finding beauty even in the most difficult circumstances. When it came time to decide on sleeping arrangements, Thomas offered his room and said he would stay on the porch. Margaret protested, but he had already decided. As she settled into the small but clean room, she could hear Thomas moving around the house, checking the locks, turning off the flashlights. Through the window, she saw him sitting in the rocking chair on the porch, looking at the stars that were beginning to appear in the dark sky. There was a loneliness in that figure that she recognized, because she had lived the same loneliness for so many years. Margaret realized that perhaps they had both found exactly what they needed, even if it was not what they expected. The sound of crickets filled the night, mixed with the soft creak of the rocking chair. That first night, they both remained awake, each in their thoughts, feeling that something important had begun between them, something that did not depend on age or appearance, but on two weary souls who had finally found a place to rest. The following days brought an unexpected and comforting routine. Margaret would wake up before dawn and prepare coffee while Thomas took care of the animals. When he returned, he found the table set and the aroma of fresh bread filling the kitchen. They ate in comfortable silence, watching the sun rise over the distant mountains. Margaret proved to be a tireless work companion. His experienced hands transformed the rustic house into a welcoming home. Curtains appeared on the windows, fresh flowers adorned the table every day, and the smell of home-cooked food replaced the odor of loneliness that Thomas had grown accustomed to ignoring. She knew cooking secrets that only decades of experience could teach, seasoning the meat with herbs that grew wild around the property. Thomas watched her work with growing admiration. There was a gracefulness to his movements, a quiet efficiency that spoke of a lifetime of caring for others. When she hummed softly while sewing on the porch, he felt a peace he hadn't experienced since childhood. The house had come alive in a way he didn't know he missed. One morning, while repairing a broken fence, Thomas saw a wagon approaching down the dusty road. His heart sank when he recognized the familiar figure of his father, Jacob Mitchell, a 68-year-old man who rarely left his own property within 40 miles. Next to him was a young woman Thomas didn't recognize, with golden hair shining in the morning sun. Jacob stepped out of the wagon with the agility of a much younger man, greeting his son with a strong hug. The young woman remained seated for a moment, watching the house with curious, bright eyes. When she finally came downstairs, Thomas could see that she was no more than 22 or 23, with a sweet smile and graceful movements. Margaret came out of the house to greet them, wiping her hands on her apron. Jacob stopped halfway, his eyes fixed on her with an expression Thomas couldn't decipher immediately. There was something about the way his father looked at Margaret, an intensity that made Thomas feel a strange discomfort in his chest. The young woman was introduced as Emma, Jacob's granddaughter on his first wife's side, who had come from the east to help her grandfather with the house. She greeted Thomas with genuine shyness, her cheeks flushing slightly as he took off his hat as a sign of respect. Margaret poured lemonade on the porch, and the four of them sat around the small wooden table. During the conversation, Thomas noticed how his father's eyes rarely strayed from Margaret. Jacob asked questions about his previous life, showing an interest that went beyond simple courtesy. Margaret responded with the same honesty she had shown Thomas, talking about the years of caring for her mother, about the brave decision to come to Arizona. Emma, for her part, seemed fascinated by life on the ranch. He asked questions about the animals, about how Thomas had built the property with his own hands, about the sandstorms that swept through the region during certain times of the year. There was a genuine curiosity in his questions, and Thomas found himself answering in more detail than he usually shared with strangers. As the afternoon progressed, a subtle tension began to form. Thomas noticed how easily Margaret and Jacob conversed, sharing stories about times he himself had not lived. There was a connection between them that transcended gender difference, a mutual understanding born of similar experiences and wisdom gained over the years. Emma helped Margaret prepare dinner, her youthful laughter echoing through the kitchen. Thomas watched through the window as the two women worked together, one representing the future he had imagined, the other representing the unexpected present he had learned to cherish. When it was time for Jacob and Emma to leave, there was a moment of hesitation. Jacob held Margaret's hand a little longer than necessary as he said goodbye, and Thomas saw something pass between them, a quiet realization that made him uneasy. Emma, for her part, looked at him with a smile that carried unspoken promises, her eyes shining with a youth he had thought he desired. That night, after the wagon disappeared into the darkness, Thomas and Margaret sat on the porch in silence. The air was laden with unasked questions and unexplored feelings. They both knew that something had changed during that visit, that the fragile foundations of their arrangement had been tested in a way that neither had anticipated. The days following the visit brought an uneasiness that Thomas could not name. Margaret continued her duties with the same dedication, but there were times when she found her standing on the porch, looking in the direction of Jacob's property. When he asked if everything was okay, she would smile and go back to work, but Thomas would find that his thoughts wandered to places he couldn't reach. Emma began to appear with increasing frequency, always with some plausible excuse. He needed help fixing a fence, wanted to learn about cattle raising, or simply passed through the area and decided to stop for a coffee. Each visit lasted a little longer than the last, and Thomas found himself awaiting his arrival with an anticipation that surprised him. During one of these visits, while Thomas showed Emma how to spot signs of disease in cattle, Margaret and Jacob walked slowly through the garden she had begun to cultivate. Watching from afar, Thomas noticed how they moved in sync, stopping to examine the same plants, pointing to the same clouds on the horizon. There was a natural harmony between them that made him feel like an intruder on his own property. Emma noticed the direction of his gaze and softly touched his arm. When he turned to her, he saw understanding in her young eyes, an emotional wisdom that contrasted with his age. She said nothing, but her touch spoke more than words, acknowledging the confusion he felt without judging him for it. That night, after Emma left with Jacob, Margaret asked to talk to Thomas. They sat in the kitchen, the soft light of the lamp casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Margaret spoke with the same honesty she had shown from day one, admitting that she was attracted to Jacob in a way she hadn't experienced in decades. He explained that he had not sought those feelings, that he had come to the ranch with the sincere intention of building a life with Thomas. But Jacob awakened in her memories of what it was like to be with someone who understood her references, who had lived through the same decades of change in the country, who shared the perspective that only the years could give. Thomas listened to every word, feeling unexpected relief mixed with what might have been sadness. When she finished, he admitted his own conflicted feelings about Emma. He talked about how her youth reminded him of dreams he had buried, about how his energy renewed parts of him that he thought he had lost forever. They talked late into the morning, two people honoring the connection they had built by being honest about the new connections they were discovering. There were no accusations or resentments, just the recognition that the human heart rarely follows the plans we make for it. In the following weeks, Jacob and Emma's visits became even more frequent. Jacob began helping Margaret with projects around the house, his knowledge of carpentry perfectly complementing her skills. They worked side by side with an ease that spoke of decades of shared experience, even if they had never met before. Emma and Thomas explored the far corners of the ranch, she riding the tame mare he had trained especially for visitors. During these rides, she talked about her dreams of owning a property of her own, about how she admired the life Thomas had built with his own hands. He found that despite her youth, Emma possessed a determination and an understanding of hard work that rivaled her own. One afternoon, as he watched Margaret and Jacob fix the porch roof together, and Emma helped prepare lemonade in the kitchen, Thomas realized that he was witnessing something greater than a simple mismatch of expectations. I was seeing four people finding exactly where they belonged, even though it wasn't where they originally thought they should be. The wind blew through the open windows, carrying the scent of the flowers Margaret had planted and the sound of laughter that echoed through the house. Thomas felt a peace settle in his chest, the understanding that sometimes fate works in mysterious ways, correcting courses we didn't even know were wrong. That night, as Jacob and Emma prepared to leave, there was a significant pause before the farewells. Glances were exchanged, silent understandings passed between the four people who had discovered that love rarely arrives in the form we expect, but always arrives in the form we need. Fall has arrived in Arizona, with its quiet promise of change. The mornings brought a coolness that relieved the constant heat of the previous months, and the leaves of the few trees around the property began to turn golden, creating a color palette that perfectly matched the contemplative mood that had settled between the four of them. Thomas woke up one October morning knowing that the time had come to face the truth that everyone had been dancing around for weeks. Breakfast passed in silence, Margaret serving pancakes with the same dedication as always, but her eyes carried an expectation that could no longer be ignored. After they had finished eating, Thomas got up and walked to the window that overlooked the road. As if conjured by his thoughts, a dark dot appeared on the horizon, growing until it became Jacob's familiar wagon with Emma at his side. But this time, the wagon carried something else, trunks and suitcases tied to the back, as if they were moving permanently. Jacob went down first, helping Emma down with the natural gallantry of an Old West gentleman. As they approached the house, Thomas noticed a determination in his father's footsteps that he recognized from his own personality. Emma walked beside him with the serene confidence of someone who had made an important decision. Margaret came out to greet them, wiping her hands on her apron in a gesture that had become familiar. As Jacob approached her, he stopped a few steps away and took off his hat, holding it to his chest in a formal pose that contrasted with the intimacy that had grown between them over the previous weeks. Jacob's words came clearly and directly, as always had been his ways. He explained that he had been awake the night before, thinking about how life can surprise us when we least expect it. He talked about how Margaret had brought a light to his days that he thought he had lost forever when his wife died 5 years earlier. He said that he understood the delicate situation, but that he could no longer pretend that he did not feel what he felt. Margaret listened to every word, with tears shining in her eyes, but not of sadness. When Jacob was done, she approached him, and placed a hand on his arm, confirming what everyone already knew, that she had found in him not only a companion, but someone who understood his journey in a way that only another person of his generation could understand. Emma approached Thomas, who had remained on the porch watching the scene unfold. She spoke with the direct sincerity she had grown to admire in him, explaining that she had come to Arizona in search of a new life and that she had found much more than she expected. He said he admired the strength with which he had built his property, the kindness with which he treated both animals and people, and the honesty with which he had faced a situation that might have created resentment. Thomas looked at this young woman who had come into his life by chance and realized that she represented not a return to the youth he had lost, but a chance to build something new with someone who shared his dreams for the future. Emma talked about expanding the ranch, about raising a family that would grow with the land, about building something lasting that would weather the storms that were sure to come. The conversation that followed was conducted with the dignity and respect that the situation deserved. Jacob explained that he had sold his property to a neighbor, using the money to buy a house in the nearby town where he and Margaret could live comfortably. Margaret contributed her savings, which she had saved through years of hard work, to ensure that they would have financial security for their golden years. Emma revealed that she had inherited a small amount from her maternal grandmother, enough to contribute significantly to the expansion of the ranch that she and Thomas had already begun planning in their conversations during the horseback rides. They talked about adding more land, building a bigger house for the family they hoped to have, creating a legacy that would last generations. As the sun moved across the sky, the practical details were discussed and resolved. Jacob and Margaret would leave at the end of the week to begin their new life in the city. Thomas and Emma would marry the following month in a simple ceremony at the local church, with Jacob officiating as the father of the groom and Margaret as a second mother to Emma. The irony of the situation did not go unnoticed by any of them. Thomas had sought a young wife and found a mature woman who, in turn, found love with her father. Margaret had travelled to marry a younger man, only to discover that the heart recognizes no boundaries of age when it finds its true match. Emma, who had come to care for her grandfather, eventually found a man who shared her vision of building something solid and lasting in the arid land of Arizona. Jacob, who had given up hope of finding companionship again, discovered that love can flourish even in the longest winters of life. That last night before the move, the four of them sat on the porch under a starry sky that seemed to bless their decisions. They talked about the future, about the children Thomas and Emma hoped to have, about the visits Jacob and Margaret would make to watch those children grow up. They talked about how fate had woven their lives in a way that none of them could have predicted. Margaret served apple pie that she had prepared especially for the occasion, using the recipe she had promised in her letters to Thomas. Now, that recipe would be passed on to Emma, who would use it to feed her own family in the years to come. The continuity of the tradition symbolized how love finds ways to perpetuate itself, even when it takes unexpected paths. When it came time to say goodbye, there was no sadness, only gratitude. Gratitude for having found each other, for having had the courage to recognize when the heart pointed in a different direction than expected, and for having built something beautiful out of what initially seemed like a mistake. Jacob and Margaret's wagon disappeared onto the dusty road on a clear November morning, carrying not only their possessions, but also the promise of a new phase of life that neither of them had dared to imagine. Thomas and Emma stood on the porch, holding hands, watching until they became just a dot on the horizon. That afternoon, Thomas began work on expanding the house, Emma by his side, handing him the tools and offering suggestions. The sound of hammers and saws mingled with their conversations about the future, creating a symphony of possibilities that echoed through the desert. The wind blew through the golden fields, carrying with it the promise that sometimes the most apparent mistakes are actually the most perfect hits, and that love, when it is true, always finds its way home, no matter how winding the roads it has to travel to get there. If you enjoyed this exciting Wild West story, don't miss our upcoming adventures. We have many other fascinating narratives waiting for you, filled with surprising twists and unforgettable characters. Subscribe to the channel now to receive all our stories firsthand and become part of our community of Western lovers.